It's me again, Mrs. Mills, your English instructor for American literature. And this week we're going to look to women and their writings. We're going to look to Emily Dickinson and her poetry, which is a little odd, but once you get used to reading it and you know her background, it's a little bit easier to understand. And I bet you can tell me which poem this image represents. I heard a fly buzz when I died. Very odd, but it has a lot of meaning. So we're going to look at Dickinson. And the other author we're going to look at, who is in your textbook, is Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She was a very influential female writer on medical conditions and medical awareness with the rest cure in her piece, The Yellow Wallpaper. Now, I have a lot of students who really don't understand the yellow wallpaper at first, but once they read it again and read the PowerPoint and the supplemental information that I give, they find it's a very, very interesting piece of literature. And I also want to show you one more thing on Gilman. This is another student-generated project. I love to show you different student artwork. And once you've read the piece, as you can see that this is the unnamed narrator in the piece, and in the background is the woman in the wallpaper. So when you read The Yellow Wallpaper, think about this image in your head. The rest cure was a popular cure back in this time, but as you guys know, we really don't have this option in the medical field anymore because it really just didn't work out. As you can see by the piece, the woman in the story went crazy. We'll talk about that in a couple minutes. So this is a beautiful piece from a student. She did a fantastic job on this picture. Okay. So if you look to your calendar and you look on the weekly folder, I have provided links to Dickinson's poetry. Dickinson's poetry is not in the book, so please refer back to those links. The main poems that we're going to look at on your calendar are I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, I'm Nobody, Who Are You, Heart, We Will Forget Him, which is very popular, just like I Heard a Fly Buzz, and, oh, Because I Did Not Stop for Death. Those 4 poems are going to be our main core, and then I might ask you to read other poems. And as you can see, Dickinson's poetry is not lengthy at all. So feel free to read on with her. And again, I know it's kind of odd, but once you read the PowerPoint and read her biography, it kind of makes a little bit more sense. All right, so let's get into Dickinson a tad further. So if you look at that PowerPoint, and I also need you to look at all the other websites and the videos and the accompanying supplemental pieces that I gave you. Especially there's a worksheet in this week's folder that will help you read Dickinson's poetry a little bit more in depth. Now, as you've read her biography and read the PowerPoint, her poetry was published after her death. Her sister, Emily Dickinson's sister, Lavinia, found her poetry and just published it. So one defense for Emily, and the reason why her poetry is so odd, is it's not finished. She never got to put the finishing final touches on her poetry. Emily Dickinson passed away, and then her sister profited and published her works. So as you read Dickinson's poetry, have it in the back of your mind that these poems are pretty much a rough draft of what Emily was feeling, her emotions at that time, and just her living in the moment. They're not finished. They're rough drafts. So that's one defense that she could have for her poetry being so weird. Okay? Remember, as you read her bio, we're still on Dickinson. Dickinson was or became a hermit. She lived in seclusion the latter half of her life. She lived in her parents' home in Amherst and just kind of stayed there, okay? She lived right next to her brother, Austin, and Austin's wife, Susan. And they had this kind of twisted family circle. And also, Lavinia, Emily's sister, lived there as well. The Dickinsons were very wealthy, and they lived this upscale life. Dickinson's parents were of high society in their town, in their community. Now, when Emily went into seclusion, critics say that she has a little past, and I'm sure you've read this. Critics say that she was bisexual, and she loved both men and women. So that could also be a reason why she never came out of the house. Think about sexuality in the 19th century, and think about it in today's society. Being homosexual or bisexual in today's society is pretty much accepted. In the 19th century, it wasn't really accepted. All right? So maybe, possibly, for discussion's sake, Emily Dickinson lived this tortured life because of her love for her brother's wife, Susan. All right? And I really need you to look into the Emily Dickinson archive in this week's folder and look at the poems that were kind of mutilated and edited by Austen and his mistress, yes, his mistress, Mabel, in accordance to Emily and Susan's relationship. So again, we don't know them. It's very up in the air, but critics say, and you'll find a lot of research on this, that Dickinson was a bisexual and she kind of hid that. And who knows, maybe her parents wanted to hide that characteristic of her because they lived in such a wealthy, high-maintenance, uppity society, and the Dickinsons didn't want their reputation tainted. And that's all for discussion. You can agree or disagree. Also, Emily Dickinson was a rebel of her time. A lot of women did not write like she wrote, and that made her kind of a rebel in the education or literary realm. All right, so think about that as well. All right, let's move on to Perkins Gilman. Perkins Gilman is a pioneer as well. She suffered, like the unnamed narrator in her piece, she suffered, I want to say, some kind of mental malady. And you can decide for yourself. Critics say that she might have had postpartum depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, or major depression. Gilman did end up with breast cancer and took her own life, obviously later. So she could have suffered from these ailments before. But she was a victim of the rest cure, as the narrator was. So when you read Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper and that little section I have this week entitled The New Woman, you can come to your own conclusion on why women were treated this way. Remember, back in the 19th century, doctors and physicians did not know a lot about women's health and or mental health. And one of the cures for mental instability was the rest cure. You stay in a room, go to sleep, just sit there and do nothing, and you'll be fine. Obviously, that didn't work. Gilman went through this rest cure. It was not helpful, and she wrote a story about it called The Yellow Wallpaper. She wanted to bring awareness to this awful, awful cure, and tell the masses that more research and more items need to be done about mental health and women's health. She wanted to get her point across that women needed to be treated a little bit differently than their male counterparts, and also mental health needed to be treated a little bit differently than physical health. So remember, at that time, the doctors and the physicians were, you know, experimenting as they go, just as a lot of things in life. Let's try it to see if it works, and the rest cure is one of those items. Remember, you have 2 blogs this week. One deals with Dickinson being a worthy candidate. Please read those directions and think through it. And the second blog deals with Gilman and male and female spaces in accordance to the yellow wallpaper. Again, critically think, read these pieces, think deeply, and elaborate. I hope you have a great time with these pieces. See you next week.